Okay, 1 p.m. Thank you so much for everybody who joined this presentation today. I'm Oris Tomaselli. I'm the president and CEO of Strategic Inspections, a reserve study firm that does a majority of the reserve study reports across the United States of America. We are located in New York, but we do an enormous amount of work in New Jersey, New York City, Connecticut, Florida, Texas, and several other states across the country. Today, we thought we'd bring you this interesting topic of the New Jersey law that was just passed regarding mandatory reserve studies, and provide you with a really great guide and tutorial for making a determination if a condominium or cooperative property needs a reserve study, which properties are excluded. There are a few types of properties that are excluded from this requirement, and how this law is going to impact boards and property managers and the attorneys who represent these boards and property managers and condominium cooperative associations. At any point in time, you can ask a question, in either the chat or in the Q&A on this presentation. We typically try and keep these webinars to about 30 minutes, and just so you have enough time to understand what the topic is, and more importantly, so you can get on with the rest of your day, because you could drudge through an hour-long webinar. But a 30-minute webinar usually is impactful and usually takes just enough of your time to get the important points of what we're trying to present. So without further ado, again, ask any questions you want. We'll try and answer those questions before the end of the presentation, should you have them, or should we be able to. If we don't get to it, we will be sending out this presentation and the recording to everybody who registered for this event. So, New Jersey new legislation. Here are the main points about this new legislation as they relate to condominium cooperative developments. This legislation was introduced on January 8th, 2024. It is required compliance for condo and co-op properties. It resulted from, it was created essentially as a specific way to ensure structural and mechanical component condition, as well as financial condition of condominium cooperative properties. But it resulted from this tragic collapse of the Champlain Tower condo in Surfside, Florida, a couple of years ago. We have all seen that story. We all saw what happened in that particular building, the loss of life that occurred there. And across several different agencies and state regulator requirements, we've seen several states now require reserve study reports, and we've seen agencies such as Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac now require reserve study reports in many instances in order for residential lending to be available in properties. We've also seen insurers start to require reserve study reports just to provide an insurance policy to an HOA or a condo or cooperative development. So this is kind of the new normal, and we've seen a major increase in requests specifically at our firm. We're very, very focused on providing reserve study reports for condo and co-op properties that are compliant with residential lending guidelines from Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and we'll delve into that a little bit today as well. So there are two different requirements here as well. There's a reserve study requirement and a structural inspection requirement. And sometimes they go together and sometimes they don't. Sometimes they're performed at different times and sometimes they're performed together. It really depends upon the property and the timing and the time frame that you need to get your reserve study done in. So New Jersey targets specific properties based upon their construction type and how old they are. And we'll delve into that again today. And there is a deadline here for compliance, which is January 8th, 2025. It seems like it's a really long time away. It's not. Essentially, to get a reserve study report done, just a reserve study, often takes between 60 and 90 days. And then to review it with a board and management and council, and determine what is compliant in the building, what issues the building may have, or what the reserves should be, and then overlaying that into an operating budget for the next year takes a lot of time. And we spend an enormous amount of time here at Strategic consulting with our condominium cooperative boards on the reserve study that we've performed. We talk about component costs. We talk about condition of components. We talk about the plans in the future for that development in doing specific, types of work to the building, whether it's, changing out some sort of amenity space, or repainting the hallways, or doing some sort of roof repair or structural condition repair. So there's a long time frame from the minute you get this report after an engineer has been on site to when you actually have a final report in hand based upon that discussion period. So it's important to kind of get these done and think about these right now. So there are very specific requirement deadlines and the timing of these reports. So I could tell you that in reading through the law, and I'm a guideline guy, in reading through this law and really paying really specific attention to, what types of buildings are required to have these reports, it's condo and co-op buildings. It's condo and co-op buildings with, concrete structures, which is most of the condo co-op buildings across the state of New Jersey. And who needs a reserve study report? Well, there's a couple of different questions a board and management has to ask themselves about a specific property. First, have they had a previous reserve study done? And has that reserve study been completed before January 8th, 2019? If they've had a reserve study done before, but it's older than 5 years, which is that January 8th date from the issuance of the guideline or the requirement of the guideline, then they have to get a new reserve study report. They have to get that report updated. If there's been no previous reserve study done on the site, a new reserve study is required. And then, in these orange boxes on the side here, we really outlined the specific grandfather laws, essentially grandfather part of this law. If a reserve study is less than 5 years old, it needs to be updated at least every 5 years. We're going to put an asterisk there because we're going to talk about residential lending compliance guidelines here as well. And Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac's lending guidelines outline that a reserve study has to be updated every 3 years. So there's a disconnect between the law and residential lending guidelines, but effectively, you're going to get a grandfathered reserve study if it was completed after January 8th, 2019. So your first question or your first look in whatever drawer you have a reserve study in, was it performed after January 8th, 2019? That'll take off a little bit of the pressure if you have a reserve study performed immediately. If a reserve study is more than 5 years old, again, or the building has no reserve study, the association has until January 8th, 2025 to complete one. So again, they don't happen overnight. You need an engineer inspection on the property. You need to run through every single component, common area component in that property. And you need to develop a reserve study on that particular property that meets not only the New Jersey law requirements, but I'd argue meets Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac's lending requirements, because why would you do one without the other? You need both in order to have something that's compliant enough so that you can continue to have values held up in the building and continue to essentially set aside the appropriate amount of reserves for component repairs. Associations that are formed after January of 2024 have 2 years after the election of a majority of the executive board to perform a reserve study. So for new construction condominium developments, which we're seeing in New Jersey, that were formed after January 8th, 2024, you have to wait essentially to the election, or you can wait to the election of a majority of the executive board 2 years after that mark. So that may mean in some of those new construction buildings that you have 3 or 4 years in order to get this reserve study done. budget compliance here is a big part of these new laws. The new law creates a funding requirement based upon the reserve funding prescription. So based upon what the reserve study engineer comes back with and says, okay, your report, your reserve contribution for 2025 should be $86,000. That's what you need to set aside in your operating budget for that year, and that has to be deposited into your reserve account. If it's more than a 10% increase to the previous year's common expense assessment, the association has 5 years to make up the deficiency. That's an interesting part of this law because that may not be compliant with residential lending guidelines now, as outlined by Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac. That shortfall may have to be contributed into the account almost immediately. And it really depends upon how well capitalized the building is. Our guess is that there are instances where there are several thousand buildings in New Jersey that do not have an amassed reserve account or a reserve contribution in their budget, and they operate via special assessment. We see a lot of these buildings, and that's why this part of the law was created. But my caution here is that part of the law, which allows you to have up to 5 years to make up the deficiency of reserve, may limit you or remove the ability for residential mortgage financing to be available in the property. So we have to go very cautiously and carefully into that world when we decide how to fund the reserve contribution that is prescribed by the engineer who's been on site. And then if the reserve line item prescription for the operating budget is less than a 10% increase to the previous year's common expense assessment, the association also has 2 years to make up the deficiency instead of the 5 years. So it really depends based upon this law how the law requires you to make up the deficiency if there is one. But again, it might run afoul of residential lending guidelines. So every single property is unique, and every single funding plan has to be looked at very carefully. So as I've outlined here in this presentation, you'll receive a copy of this. The funding plan, you really may run afoul of these Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac lending guidelines because there are very specific new guidelines that were issued by these agencies that call out critical repairs and special assessments and structural repair requirements. And if you run afoul of those critical repair requirements or run afoul of the special assessment outline that's been guidelines that have been provided by the agencies, or if you have some sort of major structural repair that needs to be completed, that work has to be completed before you can get residential lending approval in the site. So there's major issues here that are unrelated to the law specifically, but could cause problems for condominium cooperative developments going forward. It's a big deal, and it's something that we've really taken a close look at, and we've solutioned for within our reserve study report, and we'll delve into that in a second as well. So aligning that reserve study with residential and commercial mortgage lending requirements is really critical. Any reserve study performed on a condo or co-op development is going to be requested to be reviewed by any commercial lender or any residential lender within the building. So I made this a big point and a big topic here because all of these guidelines have changed so dramatically recently. But in 2022, 23, and 24, there were major lending guideline changes that were outlined by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and the FHA. The FHA is still in the process of creating their new lending guidelines as it relates to reserves and residential mortgage fundings. But most of the lending guidelines have changed, and you're seeing that change if you're a property manager on this call or a board member, even an attorney, with condominium and cooperative questionnaires that are being sent to the association to be completed to have additional addendum questions now added. The questions that now exist on a condominium or cooperative questionnaire ask questions like, is the structural condition of the property sound? Are there any critical repairs that have to be performed? How much capital does the association have set aside for reserves? How much amassed reserves do they have? All of those questions, specifically condition questions about the mechanical and structural components, have been added to condominium cooperative questionnaires. And almost every attorney we speak to has advised his property management clients and board clients, his or her property management or board clients, to not answer those questions and to utilize reports like reserve studies and engineering reports to answer those questions as a result of the liability that comes along with it. So this is kind of a double-edged sword. It's a good thing and a bad thing. Specifically, strategic inspections reserve study reports calls out all of these lender compliance requirements. In fact, we have a very special section of our reserve study report called the lender property analysis, which outlines every single aspect of a lender's questionnaire on a condominium or cooperative property. We put it in black and white and take the liability for the answers we provide, because we send a professional engineer to every single building for a site inspection. And that lender property analysis that we provide has a complete mechanical, structural, and financial condition analysis, and outlines whether or not there are critical repairs, and outlines what the future capital needs of the building are going to be, and also looks at any violations the building may have, and outlines what the repair issue is surrounding that violation, or whether or not it's a structural or mechanical condition violation. So the point I'm making is that these new lending guidelines are incredibly impactful. They're incredibly impactful when they go part and parcel with the new reserve study requirements and structural condition requirements as outlined by the state of New Jersey. And you can't do one or think about one like a reserve study or a structural condition assessment on a property without thinking about the impacts to residential lending in your building. If you don't think about them, you run the risk of having your building being unavailable for residential mortgage financing. And frankly, that impacts value greatly, not only to all the units, like essentially you turn your building into a cash only building. And that's going to really impact the values of those units. So it's important to understand it, and it's important to seek out a reserve study that provides you with compliance for these Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and FHA mortgage lending requirements. So when you look at the structural inspection part of this law, the structural inspection, the new legislation requires that it's performed on most condo and cooperative buildings. I say most because there are a couple of instances, if you really read into the law, where buildings do not need to have a structural inspection. But it's we call them unicorns. There are very few buildings, based upon how this law was written, that are not going to require a structural inspection. There's a timeline by which the condo or co-op property has to obtain a structural inspection, and we'll outline that shortly. But most buildings across the state of New Jersey are going to require it. So if a building is more than 15 years old, the association has to obtain an initial baseline structural evaluation within 2 years of January 8th, 2026. So this is really important. I said it earlier, but there are a lot of instances where you're going to get your reserve study done first and your structural inspection done at a later date. And that's frankly what we recommend, because the reserve study is going to set the association on a path of compliance with the law, compliance with lending guidelines. And the engineer that goes to do a reserve study inspection, at least from strategic inspections, will see any sort of structural issue with the property. They don't do a complete structural inspection within a reserve study, and it has to be done by a specific professional engineer that does those types of structural inspections. But the reserve study is almost always going to come first as a result of when the structural inspection is required. The reserve study is going to outline to the structural inspector what issues may be present within that building. So it really should work that way. You should get your reserve study done first, and then the structural condition and structural inspection assessment done at a later date. So if the building is less than 15 years old, the CO was given after January 8th, 2009, a structural evaluation has to be obtained before the 16-year mark. And if the structural evaluation yields a determination with any sort of structural concerns, the association has to make the necessary repairs within a deadline outlined by the structural engineer. So when you have a structural engineer come into a property, they list very specifically when work has to be performed and when the issues that they may have found has to be corrected. It's interesting. We try to recommend the best course of action for our clients. We typically don't recommend that you have the same firm do the reserve study and the structural inspection. There's a couple of reasons for that. Number one, expertise in structural inspections is different than expertise in reserve studies. Number two, the structural engineers who work on properties, you don't want them to be essentially, trying to get a reserve study to work by, not reporting the appropriate structural issues on a property. Not that we think that'll happen very often, but, we just think that division is really important for an association. And in our reserve study reports, we utilize the reports from structural engineers and input that data into our reports. So the best course of action here is, again, to get your reserve study, and then over the next 10 to 15 years, start thinking about your structural inspection requirement. So if the building is less than 20 years old, a follow-up inspection is required every 10 years from a structural perspective. If a building is more than 20 years old, you need a follow-up inspection every 5 years after you do that structural inspection report. And if damage is found to a building structural system, you need an update in 60 days. So the point here is, again, get your reserve studies done, and then you have a little bit of time to do your structural inspection on these properties, but you have to have that reserve study done before January 8th, 2025. Our reserve study report is a little bit unique. I think it's important that you know a couple things about it. It's tech enabled. A lot of our property managers love it. I mean, we do thousands of reports a year, and I will tell you that property managers love them because you can view through our password protected portal every single report on every single property you have. So I made a joke earlier saying that reserve study reports were kept in drawers or somebody's desk drawer. I'll tell you it's true. This kind of takes that away. We give access not only to the property manager, but also the board members. You can remove access from a board member or a property manager through that password protected portal as well. And you could even give that report out to additional vendors and provide them with limited access to the report. We only do on-site engineer inspection reserve studies, really focus on the board input and education, trying to outline to the board what's necessary and what's not within the funding plan. We customize those funding plans per site. So we will give you a baseline report as a draft, and then every single reserve study report that goes final only goes final with the board's input and discussion on that reserve study on what that funding plan should be. And that lender property analysis that I alluded to earlier is also included within every single reserve study report. We provide major discounts for bulk work. So important for you to understand it now. There's a couple of articles and links that I included in this presentation, not only some articles that I've been interviewed for over the years, regarding reserve studies and New Jersey's reserve study law most recently, but also the Fannie Mae lending guidelines, Freddie Mac lending guidelines that are important and that are going to impact your specific association or some of the associations you represent. You can request a proposal at any point in time through our online portal, or call us at any point in time. Our customer service division as well is really great to talk to should you have a question about a reserve study report. Here are some articles that we listed. Again, everybody's going to receive a copy of this presentation and the recording as well, and some detailed information about where to contact us. And a short disclaimer at the end here about the fact that these reserve studies, these laws are new and they are subject to change. This is as of today. So that being said, I think there's a question here. So there's an anonymous attendee that writes, and I was told we have 10 years to make up the deficiency. You could have up to, as I outlined earlier, let me just bring back the slide for you on the deficiency. And when you can update it, or when you should update it. Sorry, excuse me. Sorry, I don't make anybody dizzy. Okay. So where did it go? Apologies. Here you go. Okay. So I don't know who outlined that you had 5 years to make up the deficiency on the structural inspection. You may have 10 years to do the actual structural inspection, not make up the deficiency, but these are ripped directly. This outline about when you're supposed to actually come up with the cost for the deficiency are ripped directly from the law. So that information might be inaccurate that you've received. That's the only question I think we have today. So thank you very much for attending. Very happy to provide you with any proposal you like on a reserve study, or answer any question about your specific property. And you can call us, email us. You'll receive a copy of this presentation shortly. Thank you very much for joining.